The icy winds of fate. The icy wind tore through the city's lifeless streets, a cruel reminder of winter's grip. Gerald shivered, clutching his threadbare coat tighter, as if the thin fabric could shield him from the bitter cold and gnawing hunger within. His hands trembled, not just from the chill, but from months of malnourishment. Once a proud educator who had shaped countless young minds, Gerald was now a shadow of his former self. Life had reduced him to this, an old man shuffling through the indifferent streets, his dignity eroded by time and circumstance. A retired teacher, Gerald had spent decades inspiring children, nurturing their dreams, and guiding them toward brighter futures. Yet, in the cruel irony of life, when his own world crumbled, when financial misfortunes and personal tragedies left him adrift, there was no one to guide or support him. Even his own family had turned their backs, leaving him to fend for himself in a society that seemed to have no place for the elderly and vulnerable. As he stumbled past a bustling restaurant, the bright neon sign seemed to mock him with its glow of warmth and cheer. Inside, people laughed, talked, and dined without a care in the world. Gerald hesitated outside the door, staring through the glass at steaming plates and smiling faces. His stomach churned with hunger, a pain so familiar it had become a part of him. "Just a piece of bread," he whispered to himself, the words almost inaudible over the howling wind. He finally gathered the courage to step inside, his frail body trembling not just from the cold but from shame. The moment he entered, the restaurant's lively hum fell silent. Heads turned, and judgmental eyes bore into him. Before he could utter a word, a burly manager stormed toward him, his face twisted with disdain. "Get out. We don't need beggars scaring away our customers," he barked, his voice loud enough to echo. Tears stung Gerald's eyes as he stumbled backward, the door slamming shut behind him. The warmth and humanity inside felt like a cruel dream now sealed away from him. He shuffled to a nearby bench, the wooden slats biting against his thin frame, and pulled his coat tighter. That night, he slept beneath the indifferent gaze of streetlights, wondering if anyone in the world still cared whether he lived or died. An unexpected encounter. The city awoke reluctantly the next morning, the streets still cloaked in a gray haze. Gerald stirred at the sound of approaching footsteps. Blinking away the blur in his vision, he saw a small group approaching the restaurant. At the center of the group was a tall, striking young man flanked by security guards. Gerald recognized him immediately, Barron Trump, whose face often graced headlines. Gerald lowered his gaze, shame burning in his chest. He had no intention of begging. Not from him, not from anyone. But as Barron passed, one of the guards glanced at Gerald and muttered something under his breath. Barron stopped in his tracks, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Why is he sitting here?" Barron asked, his voice calm yet commanding. Gerald turned his head away, feeling the weight of his own insignificance. "I'm no one," he muttered hoarsely. Barron stepped closer and knelt in front of him. His gaze softened. "No one deserves to be left like this," he said firmly. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Gerald, too stunned to speak, watched as one of the guards handed him a steaming cup of coffee and a thick blanket. "Wait here," Barron said, his words kind yet laced with an air of mystery. Moments later, another guard returned with a hot meal and gently placed it in Gerald's trembling hands. For the first time in months, Gerald felt human again. Tears welled in his eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to eat right away. His hands shook too much. "Take your time," Barron said softly. "You'll need your strength." As Gerald slowly regained his composure, he couldn't help but wonder, why was someone from a world so far removed from his own showing such kindness? Barron didn't offer an explanation. Instead, after a quiet conversation with his guards, he turned back to Gerald. "You're coming with me," Barron said. Gerald's eyes widened. "What?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have a place where you can stay," Barron replied. "No strings attached." Doubt gnawed at Gerald. After months of rejection and humiliation, could he trust this stranger? But there was something in Barron's steady gaze, a sincerity that Gerald couldn't ignore. Hesitantly, he nodded. A haven of hope. The car ride felt surreal. Gerald watched the city blur past the window, the weight of despair slowly lifting with every mile. When they finally stopped, Gerald expected to see a lavish mansion. Instead, they pulled up to a modest but welcoming building. "This is it," Barron said, helping Gerald out of the car. The shelter, as it turned out, was a haven Barron had personally funded. It wasn't extravagant, but it radiated warmth and compassion, a stark contrast to the cold indifference Gerald had grown used to. Inside, the staff greeted him with genuine smiles, and the scent of fresh bread filled the air. Barron introduced Gerald to Maria, the shelter manager. "She'll take good care of you," he said before turning to leave. Gerald felt a pang of gratitude, but also fear. What would come next? Maria led him to a small but cozy room. As Gerald sat on the neatly made bed, the emotions he had bottled up for so long came pouring out. He cried, not just for the kindness he had received, but for the months of pain and loneliness he had endured. "You don't need to thank me," Barron had said before leaving. "Just promise me one thing. When you are strong again, help someone else. Rebuilding a life." Barron's words echoed in Gerald's mind as he slowly began to heal. With Maria's gentle encouragement, he started taking small steps toward rebuilding his life. At first, it was little things, helping in the kitchen, sorting donations, and greeting new residents. Each act, though simple, reignited a sense of purpose within him. One day, Gerald found himself organizing books in the shelter's small library when a group of children arrived for an after-school program. Their laughter filled the air, and for the first time in years, Gerald felt alive. He began mentoring them, sharing stories from his days as a teacher. Their curiosity and joy became his lifeline, reminding him of the man he once was. Weeks later, Barron returned, much to Gerald's surprise. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "I don't know how to thank you," Gerald replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to," Barron said with a smile. He handed Gerald an envelope. "Open it when you're ready." That night, Gerald opened the envelope. Inside was a key and a letter. The letter read, "Gerald, you've been given a second chance, and so have I. The key is to an apartment I've arranged for you. It's not much, but it's yours. There's one condition: mentor others. Share your story. Show them that even when the world turns its back on you, there's still hope. Barron." Paying it forward. The apartment was modest but beautiful, a space Gerald could call his own. With a renewed sense of purpose, he returned to the shelter the very next day. He shared his story with the residents, offering them hope and a reminder that life could change in an instant. As weeks turned into months, Gerald became a pillar of the community. He mentored others, helped them rebuild their lives, and in doing so, found his own strength. Barron's kindness had not just saved Gerald, it had inspired him to save others. And so, a cycle of hope began, proving that even in the darkest times, a single act of compassion could light the way forward. An encounter that changed everything. Dawn broke reluctantly over the city, its gray hues mingling with the remnants of the night's frost. Gerald stirred awake on the cold bench, the biting wind having robbed him of rest. His frail body ached, and his fingers, stiff from the chill, struggled to pull his coat tighter around him. As he blinked, the fog of sleep from his eyes, muffled voices, and approaching footsteps drew his attention. The streets, still cloaked in an eerie stillness, seemed an unusual setting for the group heading toward the restaurant. At their center walked a tall young man, his strides purposeful, flanked by security guards. Gerald squinted through the haze of early morning, his breath catching as he recognized the figure, Barron Trump. His image had graced countless headlines, a beacon of privilege and influence. Gerald instinctively shrank into himself, attempting to make his presence less noticeable. He had no intention of drawing attention to his plight, especially from someone whose world seemed so distant from his own. To beg or plead for help was a humiliation he could no longer endure. Yet, fate had other plans. As the group passed, one of the guards stole a glance in Gerald's direction. The brief look, leaden with disdain, triggered something in Barron. He stopped mid-stride, his gaze following the guard's line of sight. His piercing eyes landed on Gerald, taking in the frail figure hunched against the cold. "Why is he sitting here?" Barron asked, his voice calm but edged with a firmness that demanded an answer. The question startled Gerald, whose eyes darted to the pavement. Shame flooded his chest, and his voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. "I'm no one," he muttered, hoping the young man would move on. Barron, however, did not. Instead, he stepped closer, kneeling until his face was level with Gerald's. The wind ruffled his coat, but his gaze remained steady. "No one deserves to be left like this," he said, his tone unwavering. Gerald, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness in Barron's voice, could only stare in silence. Before he could comprehend what was happening, Barron had retrieved his phone and issued a series of rapid instructions. The guards exchanged glances, clearly accustomed to his decisiveness, and moved into action. Moments later, one of them returned with a steaming cup of coffee, placing it gently in Gerald's trembling hands. Another handed him a heavy wool blanket, which Gerald clutched instinctively. Barron, still crouched before him, spoke again. "Wait here," he said, his words kind yet filled with a quiet authority. Unsure of what to make of the encounter, Gerald watched as the guards disappeared into the restaurant. When they emerged, they carried a tray laden with food. A steaming bowl of soup, a warm roll, and a piece of fruit. They placed the meal carefully in Gerald's lap, their earlier indifference replaced by subdued respect. For a moment, Gerald sat frozen. The kindness of strangers was a foreign concept to him now, an almost mythical idea after months of rejection and despair. His hands trembled as he finally lifted the spoon, the warmth of the soup spreading through him like a balm. "Take your time," Barron said gently, his voice breaking through Gerald's fog of disbelief. "You'll need your strength." The young man's words carried a gravity far beyond his years, and Gerald couldn't help but wonder why someone like Barron Trump, born into a life of unimaginable privilege, would take notice of him, let alone extend such compassion. Barron, however, offered no explanations. Instead, he spoke quietly with his guards, his demeanor thoughtful and deliberate. Finally, he turned back to Gerald. "You're coming with me," he said, his words as much an invitation as they were a declaration. Gerald's brow furrowed, his mind racing. What do you mean?" he stammered, his voice weak. "I have a place where you can stay," Barron replied simply. No strings attached. The offer, so direct and yet so unfathomable, left Gerald reeling. He had spent so long on the fringes of society, ignored and dismissed, that the prospect of someone caring enough to intervene felt almost unreal. Doubt crept into his mind. Could this be genuine? What if it wasn't? But then he met Barron's gaze, a look of unwavering sincerity that seemed to pierce through every barrier Gerald had erected around his heart. Against his better judgment, he nodded, his voice barely audible as he whispered, "Okay." The journey to hope. As Gerald climbed into the warmth of the car, he felt a mixture of fear and cautious hope. The world outside blurred into a mosaic of lights and shadows as they drove through the city. Barron sat silently beside him, his presence calm but commanding. Gerald stole a glance at the young man, curiosity swirling in his mind. Why had he stopped? What had driven him to care about someone so insignificant in the grand scheme of life? They arrived at a modest building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Gerald stared out the window, expecting the opulence often associated with the Trump name. Instead, he found himself looking at a structure that exuded warmth and simplicity, a stark contrast to the cold, unfeeling streets he had known. "This is it," Barron said, stepping out of the car and motioning for Gerald to follow. Inside, the shelter buzzed with quiet activity. Volunteers moved about with purpose, their faces kind and welcoming. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of soft music. Gerald's breath hitched as he took it all in, the unfamiliar sensation of safety and comfort washing over him. "This shelter is something I've been working on," Barron explained. "A place for people like you to rebuild, to find hope again." Gerald's throat tightened, emotions swirling too intensely to name. Barron guided him to a small room, modest but clean, with a neatly made bed and a chair by the window. A warm quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray monotony of Gerald's recent life. As Gerald sat down, the weight of months, years of struggle pressed down on him all at once. Tears spilled freely down his weathered cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You don't need to," Barron replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Just promise me one thing. When you're ready, when you've found your strength again, help someone else." Those words, spoken with such conviction, lodged themselves in Gerald's heart. As Barron turned to leave, Gerald felt a strange but undeniable spark of hope, a tiny ember flickering in the ashes of his despair. Perhaps this was the start of something he had thought impossible. A new beginning. A place to begin again. Gerald sat on the edge of the small bed, staring out the window of his new room. The first rays of morning sunlight painted the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, a stark contrast to the darkness he had grown accustomed to. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the edge of the warm quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. It had been years since he'd felt the comfort of something so simple, a safe place to sleep, a room filled with warmth instead of fear. The shelter was quiet, the hum of early morning activity only beginning to stir. Outside his door, the faint clatter of dishes and the murmur of voices drifted down the hallway. Gerald took a deep breath, trying to ground himself in this unfamiliar sense of security. The events of the past 24 hours replayed in his mind like a dream. Barron Trump, the meal, the warmth of the blanket, and the promise of a second chance. It all felt surreal, as though the universe had decided, just for a moment, to extend him a kindness he thought he'd never see again. Yet with that kindness came a weight he hadn't anticipated, a mix of gratitude and an almost paralyzing fear. What if this was temporary? What if it all disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived? The weight of the past. As the morning unfolded, Gerald stepped cautiously into the shelter's common area. The space was modest but welcoming, with sunlight streaming through large windows and casting soft patterns on the wooden floors. A handful of residents gathered around a long table, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. The scent of fresh bread wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint aroma of brewing tea. Maria, the shelter manager, greeted Gerald with a warm smile. Her kind eyes met his as she approached, a steaming cup in her hand. "Good morning, Gerald," she said, her tone gentle yet steady. "Did you sleep well?" Gerald hesitated, unsure how to respond. Sleep had come in fits and starts, his mind too restless to fully relax. But he nodded, not wanting to seem ungrateful. "I did," he murmured. "Thank you." Maria handed him the cup. "Take your time settling in," she said. "There's no rush. Breakfast will be ready soon." As she walked away, Gerald felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Acknowledgement. The simple act of being seen. It was such a small gesture, yet it meant everything to someone who had been invisible for so long. Gerald found a seat near the window and stared out at the bustling city beyond. The world moved on, indifferent to his existence, yet here he was, sheltered from its harshness for the first time in what felt like an eternity. His thoughts wandered back to his former life, his days as a teacher, his family, the home that had once been filled with laughter and love. Those memories, though cherished, were now tinged with pain and betrayal. His children, once the light of his life, had abandoned him when he needed them most. Financial misfortunes had stripped him of everything: his home, his savings, his pride. He had given his family everything he had, only to be cast aside when his world crumbled. The weight of that rejection still bore down on him, threatening to snuff out the fragile spark of hope Barron's kindness had ignited. Finding purpose in the present, Maria's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "Gerald, would you like to join us in the kitchen? We could use an extra pair of hands." Gerald blinked, startled by the invitation. His first instinct was to decline. After months of feeling useless, the idea of contributing seemed almost foreign. But something in Maria's expression, her calm patience, her quiet encouragement, nudged him forward. He stood slowly, his movements hesitant, and followed her to the kitchen. The space was alive with activity, pots bubbling on the stove, volunteers slicing vegetables, and the rhythmic clatter of dishes being stacked and washed. Maria handed him a small pile of potatoes and a peeler. "Start with these," she said with a smile. Gerald stared at the potatoes, his hands trembling slightly as he picked one up. It was a simple task, yet it felt monumental, as though this small act of peeling potatoes was a step toward reclaiming a piece of himself. As he worked, the tension in his shoulders began to ease, and a faint sense of purpose took root. The hours passed quickly, and by the time breakfast was served, Gerald found himself smiling. A small, tentative smile, but genuine nonetheless. He watched as the residents gathered to eat, their laughter and conversation filling the room with a warmth he hadn't realized he craved. For the first time in months, Gerald felt like he belonged. The echo of Barron's words. Later that day, as Gerald sat by the window in his room, he reflected on the events of the morning. Maria's invitation, the camaraderie in the kitchen, the simple act of peeling potatoes, it had all reminded him of the man he used to be. A teacher, a guide, someone who had once found joy in helping others. Barron's words echoed in his mind. "Just promise me one thing. When you are strong again, help someone else." The weight of that promise lingered, both daunting and inspiring. Could he truly help others? Could he give back in the way Barron had given to him? The doubts that had plagued him for so long began to fade, replaced by the faintest glimmer of determination. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, Gerald made a quiet vow to himself. He would honor Barron's kindness. He would find a way to pay it forward, to use his experiences, his pain, his loss, his resilience, to inspire and uplift others. For the first time in years, Gerald felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. The power of compassion. Weeks turned into months, and Gerald's life slowly began to change. The shelter, once a foreign and intimidating place, became a sanctuary where he could rediscover himself. With each passing day, the fragments of his old life, his confidence, his purpose, his sense of worth, began to reassemble. Maria encouraged him to take on more responsibilities, and Gerald found himself thriving in ways he hadn't imagined. He became the shelter's unofficial mentor, offering guidance to others who, like him, had lost their way. His experience as a teacher came alive once more as he worked with children who visited the shelter after school. Their laughter was infectious, their curiosity boundless, and in their wide eyes, Gerald saw reflections of his former students, reminders of the man he once was and the potential he still carried. A return visit. One evening, as Gerald helped a young boy with his homework, a familiar commotion at the shelter's entrance caught his attention. Looking up, he saw Barron Trump standing in the doorway, his presence as commanding as ever, but with an air of humility that seemed almost contradictory to his status. Gerald froze, unsure of what to say. Barron had already given him so much, more than he could have ever asked for. What else could he possibly want? "How are you settling in?" Barron asked, his voice calm but genuinely curious. "I don't know how to thank you," Gerald stammered, emotion thick in his voice. Barron smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his tone as steady as the first time they'd met. "But I wanted to check on you and share some news." The word hung in the air, leaden with mystery. Gerald's curiosity piqued, and Barron handed him an envelope. "Open it when you're ready," he said simply before turning to leave. That night, Gerald sat on his bed, staring at the envelope. His hands trembled as he tore it open, revealing a neatly written letter and a check. The letter read, "Gerald, the work you've been doing at the shelter has not gone unnoticed. Your story and your resilience have inspired more people than you realize. I've set up a fund in your name to help expand the shelter's programs and provide more opportunities for others who are struggling. Use it wisely and continue to be the light you've become. The world needs more people like you. Barron." Gerald's breath caught in his throat. The generosity of Barron's gesture was overwhelming. But what touched him most was the recognition, the belief that he, a man who had once felt invisible and discarded, could make a difference. Paying it forward, over the following months, the shelter blossomed. With the new funding, they were able to provide more resources, create educational programs, and expand their reach. Gerald took an active role in mentoring residents, organizing workshops, and sharing his story with those who felt hopeless. His journey became a beacon for others, proof that even when life seemed irredeemably dark, kindness and perseverance could light the way forward. One young man in particular stood out, a teenager named Marcus, whose struggles mirrored Gerald's in many ways. Marcus had lost his family and his faith in the world, but under Gerald's guidance, he began to rebuild his confidence. "Do you really think I can turn my life around?" Marcus asked one evening, his voice trembling with doubt. Gerald placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Yes, I do. Because I did. And if I can, so can you. But it starts with believing you're worth saving. A lesson for all." As Gerald looked back on his journey, he realized that Barron's act of kindness had been a spark, not just for him, but for countless others. It was a reminder of the profound impact a single act of compassion could have. The lesson was simple yet powerful. No matter how broken a person may feel, they are never beyond redemption. Sometimes, all it takes is one hand reaching out, one person willing to see past the surface and into the soul. Gerald's life had been transformed not just by Barron's generosity, but by his belief that Gerald was still worthy of care and purpose. In the end, Gerald understood that life wasn't about avoiding hardship. It was about how we rise from it and how we use our experiences to uplift others. And as he stood in the shelter one evening, watching Marcus laugh with a group of children, Gerald knew that he had not only found his own redemption, but had become a part of something far greater, a chain of hope and kindness that would continue to grow. Final reflection. The story of Gerald and Barron reminds us that no one succeeds alone, and that every life, no matter how broken, holds value. It teaches us that small acts of kindness, when rooted in sincerity, can ripple outward in ways we may never fully understand. Whether through a meal, a word of encouragement, or simply believing in someone when no one else does, we all have the power to change lives, including our own. In the end, the world doesn't change through grand gestures alone. It changes through countless small acts of love and compassion. And as Gerald proved, even when the world turns its back on you, there is always hope waiting in the kindness of strangers.